Angela, who Angela has been a friend of our BOCES and a friend of many of the districts across the New York State area, particularly, I would say, Angela, in the downstate portion, probably, right, at Long Island, areas of Westchester, and the like. Angela is one of the senior consultants for Learning Centered Initiatives, a organization that has always been focused on furthering our skill sets as educators. We've had a fantastic relationship with Giselle Martin-Kniep, who leads that organization with their team members like Angela and Diane Cunningham, who we've done work with. And one of the areas that Angela has really helped educators across the state, the country, and the world around has been thinking about curriculum and curriculum design. She's written in the area before. We share the opportunity to have done work for ASCD, and Angela has written for the organization in the past and is a real wealth of knowledge in helping us think about how we need to shift our thinking around curriculum design. And so we're really excited to have her join us for this session. And Angela, I'm going to turn it over to you. So I'm going to give you hosting rights, and then you'll be able to take over. So you should now be the host.
Okay. So good morning, everybody. I just shared, before I get started, a link in the chat box, and that's going to take you to a folder that has several different documents that that will be used during this session. So if that's something that you want to go into now, I'm kind of just going through the welcoming. You're going to see a note catcher, which just will help you as we're talking. And then there'll be an activity in there. There'll be an annotated template that I'll reference later on, and there's going to be a copy of the PowerPoint. So just so that you know that's in there, and I just posted that in the chat box. Let me share my screen with you. And as I do so, I just want to thank everybody for coming. There's a lot of people there who I know, and I greatly appreciate you coming out this morning. You've heard me talk about curriculum a lot, and you're here today. And for those of you that I don't know, welcome. Thank you for joining me. And of course, it always turns out, oh, there we go, as we're talking, that I couldn't get my PowerPoint to work. So welcome. I know that we have visitors from all over, and just getting. And what I want to talk to you about today is really just talking about my ideas about curriculum moving forward. So we have a couple of important questions. We're going to talk about what we've learned over the last couple of months from teaching from our homes, and how we can use this experience in moving forward. So just to get us started, I want you just to take a second and to reflect on this question. What have you learned over the last 2 months that can be used to inform curriculum and instruction decisions for next year? And as you just think about that, think about what's worked really well for you and with the teachers that in your classroom or the teachers that you work with, and what's something that perhaps didn't work well, but you're learning from. It's something that you want to take into consideration. And if you just take a moment in the chat box, share some of your ideas. We're going to use this as a basis for our conversation today. So I'll give you a second to write some of those down. And of course, I can't see the chat box. So just give me a minute.
So Angela, one thing that you can do, sometimes with Zoom when you're presenting, the chat box can be slow to open up if you try to open it when you're in presentation mode. But okay. I can also let you know what people are, where you can do that too. Yep, and then you can see what people are writing.
Yeah, and as you just share, you can kind of introduce yourself, as some of you already have, and I see some familiar names in there. So Tina, hello from Norwalk. We've been working together. So thank you for joining us. I see some of my Southampton crew out there. See Julio from somewhere in the South today. So Matt is joining us. Wisconsin, Matt. Thank you for coming today. Oh, Samantha's here from Bedford. So these are all some of the people that I've worked with. And as I'm beginning to read through the chat box here, some of the learnings that we've had as a result of the last couple of months, things that pop out to me is one, that the traditional teacher-centered approach to learning does not necessarily work in a remote setting, and that's something that's very true. Matt said that there's a minimalist approach to curriculum development. Less is more, and I think that has a lot to do with what I'm going to talk about today and moving forward. We need to really be flexible. There needs to be a lot there in terms of allowing teachers to be very responsive to their students' needs, and so that's a case of less is more. What are the guidelines that need to be in place that allows teachers to make those purposeful decisions? I have some representatives here from PS 108 in the Bronx, one of the schools so Georgette is there, and I saw Lori come in. Samantha has mentioned here that it's important to prioritize skills and concepts. Again, that philosophy that less is more. There's a push in thinking. Yeah, I think we have to really get kids to think more deeply, and when we do, they actually engage in the learning process a little bit more. So many of the things that you're listing here really have gotten me thinking over the last few weeks about how do we move forward, right? How do we take these lessons, both good and bad things that have happened, and make some decisions about how we can prepare basically for an unknown. We're in a situation where there is various plans to how we can approach next year. We have to be prepared for all different kinds of models. And so we have to go into this with preparation is key, but how do you prepare to the point where it's not too much, but it's not too little? So let me go back to sharing my screen, and I'm going to share with you some of the ideas that I've had that's come from talking to teachers and administrators over the last few weeks, last few months about successes and needs. So go back here. Okay. So in thinking about moving forward, I suggest that there's 4 steps in planning a curriculum for what I call strategic implementation. So we know we have to give enough information for teachers to be able to make strategic decisions about what happens in their classroom, regardless of what that classroom looks like. And so those 4 steps kind of share what I call the information for that purposeful decision making without being overwhelming. And so let me unpack them for you. And then at the end, when we're done taking a closer look at each of the 4, we're going to go into an activity where I'm going to give you some samples. And so we can say, so what are these ideas? What could they possibly look like? And I also invite you at this time in that folder, there was a note catcher which lays out these 4 different steps in planning for a strategic implementation. So first, it's one of the things that was listed when in the chat box was about prioritizing. This is definitely a time for less is more. Everything can't have equal weight. We need to really say what is the most important learning. And so that is going to take some prioritization. When we're prioritizing, we have to consider not just content. We really need to move towards a conceptual understanding, and as well consider the practices that are specific for the different disciplines. we need to somehow convey what is the most important learning in for a unit of study. I jumped way ahead. Sorry, everybody. The second thing that we have to do, besides prioritizing, is we have to set a context for learning. One of the things that I saw again in the chat box was this idea of when we do things in isolation, when kids are engaged in just learning tasks that are unrelated to each other, what happens is that they're not invested. They don't feel like they're in pursuit of some kind of deeper learning. So we do have to go back to what we know about quality curriculum design, which is laying out the essential question and big idea. So we've done this in curriculum for years, and it shouldn't go away because all of a sudden we have changed the way that instruction is taking place. We actually need to go back and remind ourselves, what is it that we're laying out that's going to be in the pursuit of the student learning? So what is that question that's going to guide their inquiry? And what is that big understanding that we want them to walk away? This big idea and this essential question will set that context because it also lays out what we want students to do to show what they've learned. And that's in the performance assessment. So here's an example from Southampton. And one of the things that those of you who have worked with me in the past know that I look at like a triangle of planning. So we look at the big idea, we look at the essential question, and we know that that performance assessment has to align. So that is going to set the context for all the work that students are going to be doing. And therefore, if they're working, whether they're home, whether they're in the traditional classroom, if they're in a hybrid situation, they're working towards something, and there are these smaller check-ins along the way. So the performance assessment with the big idea and the essential question is what we use to set that context. Probably what's a little bit different than our traditional design is designing what I call from an asset approach to learning. So one of these other things that we have to be concerned with going into next year is that we start instruction from a place of what students can do versus what they're missing or what they're lacking. So there's a great deal of information out there and conversations that I've had with teachers and administrators about the loss of learning. And unfortunately, if we come into the classroom with this idea that students can't do something, they're going to hear that and they may react accordingly. So we have to come from a place of what they can do. So one of the things that I'm suggesting when we're planning curriculum for next year is that we take a look at our priority skills and content and work our way backwards to foundational skills and content, so that we can see what was it that they were supposed to have as a foundation coming into the grade level, use that as a starting point to move them forward to where they need to be. So we need to go beyond just saying this is our grade level expectation and really look at how curriculum aligns across grade level, how our expectations align across grade levels. And it's from there that we can start putting language to students in terms of what they can do rather than what they're missing. So designing from an asset-based approach to learning means taking a look at our priority skills and our content and working our way back to what should be foundational, but it also means checking in to determine where they are on that continuum of learning. So more than ever, diagnostic assessments as part of our curriculum is going to be imperative. It's going to be extremely important to how we convey a growth mindset and an asset approach to learning to our students. So we need to design simple, classroom-based diagnostic assessments that allow us to check in and say, which of these priority skills where is their starting point in relationship to these priority skills? How are those foundational skills evident in the work that they can do? And from there, say, how are we going to move them forward? So what you see here on the screen are just examples, because it's not about coming up with a standardized kind of diagnostic assessment or some other tool that seems distant. It's really thinking about what are those foundational skills for this unit, and then designing something that is more of a learning experience for kids to be able to say, where are they? What can they do? So these are simple things that teachers do in their classrooms, and if they tie them to those foundational skills, they'll be able to get a better sense of where students are starting. This is an example from mathematics. So I was talking to John Wendt, who's on our screen yesterday, about mathematics. And we were talking about a 6th grade example that you're going to use later on. And so the obvious place in mathematics is always to look at what was it that was supposed to be taught the previous year, and to use your diagnostic or base your diagnostic assessment on that, so you can figure the foundational skills moving students forward. So often what we want to do with a diagnostic is figure out what they know in terms to the grade level standards, but it would be better in moving them or getting them started if we started with what their foundational skills were. So this is a bit of a change, because usually we leave this up to teachers, but we're saying that in planning for next year, we need to have that readily accessible to teachers to make those instructional decisions. It should be something that we're putting on our curriculum documents or curriculum resources right from the beginning, so teachers aren't searching for it for every single unit of study that they're going to be designing and implementing as they go across the year. The other thing that we want to make sure is taking place, so that we're designing from an asset-based approach to learning, is that in our performance assessment, and this example comes from PS 108, who is also joining us today, that when we're thinking about performance assessments, we think about what I call curriculum embedded performance assessments, because they're a type of assessment where you are learning by doing. They're not happening at the end. They're happening throughout the unit. A lot of people will refer to these as projects. So in them, as you read through this, you'll see they're underlined, are these naturally embedded formative assessments, where teachers can do a stop and check for student understanding. It's a place for students to engage in peer feedback or feedback with the teacher. And then from there, the teacher can adjust instruction, provide additional resources, determine who needs a face-to-face conference. And students can continue to move along that continuum from where they are to where they need to be. And finally, the 4th step in preparing for strategic implementation has to do with identifying core active learning strategies. So one of the things that we want to do in planning for next year is not rewrite curriculum. It's not about really saying that we have to write out everything that's going to happen. We don't need a plan, a scope and sequence. We want to focus on the instructional strategies that are tied to those priority standards and skills that are going to be used repeatedly throughout the unit of study. And what we do by having core active learning strategies is that we're giving students the tools to engage in their learning, so that they're not focusing so much on the activity, but they're really focusing on what they're doing. So if you look at this example, something like SOAP, that's something that social studies teachers use often. You teach it once and you use it over and over again as students are looking at primary sources. So they're not learning new acronyms continually, they're applying it to their analysis. And so I think there's some chat here. Someone is okay. All these tasks help build student identity as a writer, as a researcher. So Matt's points are very much really, really important, because what he's talking about there is that we're working as practitioners in the field. So when we switch over to what students can do in their learning and we ask them to repeatedly use them, what we're being able to do then is really giving students tools to be responsible for their own learning. So it's not coming up with as many possible learning situations or learning experiences as you can. It's about using them, sharing them with kids so that they can have students repeatedly use them in their learning process. So in planning for next year, we have to be selective. Okay? We have to give teachers, or teachers need to think about what they can do so that it is easily accessible and usable for planning for instruction. So what I want to do is give you my vision of this. This is a work in progress. I want you to realize that. Because we're all in that situation of what are we learning from our experience to inform what happens next year. And so the examples I'm going to share are just that. They're examples. They're not to say that this is the only way to do them. To do this kind of planning, it's to give you a sample of what a document might look like. And I've talked to several groups about how to best use this document or something similar. And what I've come up with is that for some groups, it's going to be a tool for extracting information from existing curriculum documents. So for some groups, they've got pretty extensive curriculum. It's just that we know that given what we're going into next year with so many unknowns, that going to that curriculum document might be overwhelming. So this serves as the cover page. For others, they don't have this very extensive written curriculum. And so this can be a simple way to plan. For another group, it might be that they rely really on their resources, but using a resource in a classroom versus using a resource in a hybrid kind of model or completely online doesn't work the same way. And so again, it's another way to look at that. So what I'm going to ask Fred to do is he's going to break you up into breakout sessions. And there's a link to the Google Drive. And when you go in there, there is a document that says activity. And these directions that appear on the screen in front of you will also be in that document. And so what I'm going to ask you to do is do a simple read through of the 3 examples that are there. I tried to get a high school, a middle school, and an elementary school example. Select one. Select it based on more about what you noticed rather than the level, I think, because you'll be in mixed groups. And really what I'm asking you to do is to think about how does the example illustrate those 4 steps that I shared with you. Once you've had a chance to discuss that, you may want to look at the rest of the examples, just noticing how they're similar or different. Because the point of this exercise is not that there's one way to do it. It's about these are different ways to consider these 4 steps in planning. And then you have to, the idea is that you take that back to your own district, to your own classroom, and say, so what would this look like for us? And so I would say I'll give you about 10 minutes to do a quick, I'm trying to think of 10 or 15 minutes. So it's planned for 10. You might get a couple extra minutes in there. We'll do a quick check-in and take a look at the examples, and then we'll see what you learned from as a result. So I'm going to give this back to Fred.
I've got it, yeah. And how many people would you like per room?
Can we do about 5?
Yeah, give me 1 second. I'm just going to adjust that up. So let's say that. So I think what we'll end up with is we'll have some rooms with 4 and some with 5, if that's okay.
Yep.
Okay, so let me just do that real quick. Just want to make sure the numbers work out. So bear with me for 1 second. Yes, perfect. All right, so I'm now going to send out the invitation to go to your rooms. Each room should have 4 or 5 people, and that invitation is coming to you now. And we'll send a, what did you say, about 10 to 15 minutes, Angela?
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll send a reminder when we've got a few minutes left for people to know.
Okay.
So people are heading to rooms now. People will start to come back in shortly.
Okay.
And they're still in rooms now, so people are still chatting. Hmm? Yeah, if you want to. Oh, you made an extra? Why, you don't want to finish it?
No, I have. You want
You're going to make a new hot chocolate? Oh, yeah, if you want. Can I have a napkin too, babe? Thank you.
Yes, I see Lori and Katie and John and Julio. Up there's Georgette. That Tina. It's like Hollywood Squares, you know? Up there's Katie.
So I think we have people back, Angela.
Okay.
So yep. So I think you're good to go. And I'll give you the presenter rights if you want to share again. Hold on.
Yeah, I'm gonna ask for people just kind of to be able to share out. What were some of your observations? How did you see those 4 steps in prioritizing curriculum evident in the examples? And what did you learn from them? So you can unmute. I think it would be nice to hear voices if that's okay with everybody. I know it's not generally done, but anybody want to kind of share your thinking? The big silence. I was warned that if I did it this way, there would be silence.
Oh,
Tina.
Mary, are you going?
Sure, I can just briefly say, I think one of the things that we talked about, but I really appreciated, was that in each example, it was distilled down to just a few standards. So it wasn't this laundry list of many, many things. It was just really what's essential. And I think that really helps, rather than thinking, we could rationalize all these things that we might be working on in some connected way, but what are the big rocks, so to speak.
Yeah. Thank you, Mary. I appreciate that.
So 2 of the things we talked about in our group was the importance of that essential question as a way to frame that deep thinking. And Angela, I don't know if you made these, but I think you probably did, because you're so good at writing essential questions. But so, having a really robust, big, broad essential question so that you could tie in a lot of concepts and context to the learning. Because what we really liked as well was that there was a lot of instructional strategies that were named in the science one that we were looking at. And there weren't an abundant number of them, but the strategies that were chosen were explicitly aligned to a lot of opportunities for conversation and discourse and synthesis and compare and contrast. So the strategies that, that were chosen were lend itself to a lot of reading and writing, listening and speaking, a lot of conversation throughout the activities.
Yeah, and I appreciate you pointing that out, because I think one of the things, the takeaways from looking at these documents is when we're talking about core active instructional strategies, there's a couple of key words in there. One is core, meaning that you don't need a lot. You really should be focusing on not coming up with something that's new and novel all the time, but really using something where they're repeated so students learn them well, and they can actually use them as tools for learning, rather than having to be bogged down with another acronym or another template or another way of doing something. So like, if we give them the core ones, they've got something to hold on to. And then they're clearly tied to standards, so that we're giving them a practice. When you have something that's core, when you have it that it's repeated, it becomes a practice for the learner. And that's really what it's all about. So you don't need a lot. Other thoughts and insights from looking at those examples, Katie?
I really like the diagnostic that you had in there in terms of the, asset-based approach, because I know, like, conversations with colleagues, we keep saying, students are going to come back with gaps, and rather, thinking in terms of what students don't know, and that's hard to fill all those gaps, starting from a place of what can they do. I think that's a much more positive and also productive conversation at this point.
Yeah, and it's switching the conversation. So not looking at student work and looking all for the faults and the deficits. It's looking at student work and saying, look at what they can do. And so if we start there, Here's what can help them to move forward. Otherwise, all what we've been doing around growth mindset in schools will be, we're going completely against that philosophy. We'll be working from a fixed mindset. So the conversation has to be from what can they do? And when you list foundational skills, it gives teachers the language to start that conversation or to have that conversation with students right from the beginning. So it's a little work up front with the idea that in the long run, that work will help teachers work with students. Any other takeaways from looking at those examples?
Angela,
Yes.
John had written in the chat, talking a little bit. So he wrote, I'm just going to read it out. The focus
Sure.
and intent of utilizing diagnostics to bring prior knowledge to the foreground was prevalent and really valuable in helping to identify gaps that have come about during remote learning. And so kind of taking a look at where there is coherence, right, is essential, and building towards those performance-based opportunities is going to be really important.
Yeah, and I have to thank John sat with me for half an hour yesterday looking at the math example. I wanted to check my thinking. And, it is, again, a way to do that alignment piece. So you do you create your diagnostic based on your foundational skills. You're not going into all these other documents. You're just looking for that key connection, and then you know what students are bringing with them. So I think it's one of the major changes that we need to make for next year, is that focus on using diagnostics that are classroom based and that give teacher immediate feedback about what students are bringing with them. We have to be more strategic with the formative assessments. So when we're working on projects or what I call curriculum embedded performance assessments, students are working on something for a longer period of time with lots of check-ins. So it allows students to have that opportunity to work independently when they're not with the teacher, to be more, when they are with the teacher, to use their time to conference, to get feedback, to get what they need. So it allows for that adjustment based on what instruction will look like, whether it's all in person, all at home, or somewhere in between. So, the major point of what I'm trying to share with you today is about that strategic planning. Teachers, as you all know, are, they're already, it's an overtaxed system. There's not a lot of time for them to do a lot of planning. So we have to think about how can we do it, again, in a very strategic way. Use what teachers already have so they can extract information. If they don't have a written curriculum to operate from, then giving them something that's very simple to be able to say, this is what we need to think about so that you can move forward.
I had a question for clarification.
Sure.
So the foundational skills are the things we should expect the kids to know, but they may not.
Yes.
Whereas the coming in, whereas the priority skills are the things we want them to acquire and embed and ultimately become independent in by the end of the unit. And they're connected to the foundational skills. Is that accurate?
Yes. So there's a couple of ways, I'm glad you're bringing that up, Matt, because there's a couple of ways you can go about identifying your foundational skills. So you work backwards from your priority skills. So the examples that you saw there had everything from a standard to a listing of a topic to an I can statement. And so three different approaches are, the standards themselves are all scaffolded, for example. So you can look at English language arts, you can look at your grade level, go to the grade level before, and know what your foundational skills are. So if you think very much standards based and that's comfort level for you, that's one approach. That's how I think, but I am the first one to say, I memorize the standards, so we just said, but I think that way. Other teachers, and I found this a lot with math teachers, they will list what their content is. They know very well what their content is. They don't need necessarily to look it up, particularly when you get into middle and high school. And so if you ask them, what should students know to be able to do this, they can tell you. So maybe they don't need to go to a document. But it's the idea, start with your priority being that grade level expectation, and then think backwards to what should they have to reach it. So even though you read it foundational priority, you write it priority foundational, because you're working backwards. But the information then is right there in front for the teacher.
Lori, I know you had mentioned that your mic wasn't working. Were you able to fix it, or it's still, no? Okay. Because Lori had said she'd be happy to share, but she can't actually share.
Yes. Yeah, so PS 108, Lori's from PS 108, and they were my first kind of experiment with this. I shared it with them and I said, so everybody, what do you think? And their feedback was very valuable. So this is, everybody's learning as we're going through this. And that's why I really want to be cognizant that there's not one way to do it. It's about thinking about these important aspects and coming up with that tool, that template, a place to house the information so that teachers can be very strategic moving forward. And so I know we're getting to the end of our time together, but I really wanted to be able to put this thinking out there. And I would be curious to see where you take it, how you think about it, what you do with this to make it usable and friendly to yourselves, to the teachers that you work with. And so I invite you to contact me with your ideas, your feedback on this, because I think that as overwhelmed as we are in the system right now, we have to start looking towards next year so that we don't feel the same way when we start off in September. And these might be some strategic steps for getting there. So on that note, Fred, I know it's 10:55.
Thanks, Angela.
Well, thank you. And I thank everybody for coming this morning. And as I said, you're more than welcome to reach out with me with your ideas, your feedback, with questions, with how you modify, how you take this, back to your classroom or the teachers that you work with.
And Angela, does everyone have your contact info? Was it in the slideshow?
Yes, it was right at the beginning.
Perfect.
Yeah, so you can it's from the first page there.
Perfect. And what I'm going to do first, Angela, we want to thank you for joining us and kind of sharing the thinking. It was really helpful for me to think about, and when all of you were in breakout groups, Angela and I were chatting, and I had shared that just this morning I had a conversation with a colleague from the Norwalk school system in Connecticut about the important nature of moving from any kind of focus on a deficit way of thinking to an asset-based one. And right, we always know that that's an important move. But what I shared with Angela, which is so true, is that my colleague and I were talking about how the pandemic has it's kind of further separated our deficits from our assets, right? Like, so what was working in our organizations really well, those assets have become even more clearly defined. What wasn't working well, that's become even more apparent, right? So this idea of making sure that we're focused on an asset-based way of thinking is really important for us now. So I'm going to, real quick, first, Angela, I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank everybody for joining us. It was a great session, Angela. And what I'm posting in the chat is our professional learning on the go placemat for the rest of this week. As we get towards the end of the year, we'll be shifting some elements of our professional learning on the go work to a different format. So stay tuned for that. You can always find details on the PNW BOCES website. And of course, these sessions are all at no cost and open to anyone. So thank you all for joining us and for giving us your 10 o'clock hour. We have you ending 3 minutes ahead of schedule, right? So enough time to maybe get a drink of water before you go on to your 11 o'clock sessions, right? Or something hot, right? So Angela, thanks again. It was great to learn with you, and have a great rest of the day, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate your time. Take care.